Cubans who come to the United States without a visa will no longer be allowed to stay here. President Barack Obama's move, announced Thursday, reverses a 1995 policy that granted special status to Cubans and helped change the political, economic, and cultural landscape of South Florida. The so-called wet foot, dry foot policy opened the floodgates for Cubans to come here. If they made it to U.S. soil, they were granted permanent residency after a year and a day. Obama's move, revealed just 8 days before President-elect Donald Trump takes office, might not survive long past his presidency. It's monumental. The one community that really did enjoy special status was Cuban exiles, and this, along with the death of Fidel Castro, signals, at least in the short term, the end of perceived hostilities between the U.S. and Cuba, said Fernand R. Amandi, a principal of the Miami-based public opinion research and communications consulting firm Bendixen Amandi International and host of a weekday morning program on radio station WIOD-AM 610. And now, next move President Trump, he added. Callers flooded Spanish-language radio Thursday evening in South Florida, expressing a mix of sadness and confusion over the news. Some wondered how the policy change would affect Cubans who arrived today and how the change would affect Cubans on the island. The news is unfortunate, said a man on radio station WIOD-AM 1140, which is based in Miami. This is very sad for Cubans, but it doesn't surprise me that the Obama administration would do this. The Obama administration announced the new policy anonymously through an unnamed senior administration official. The official told news organizations in Washington, D.C., that the change was effective immediately and follows months of negotiations between the U.S. and Cuba. The change is effective immediately for Cuban nationals, who attempt to enter the United States illegally and do not qualify for humanitarian relief, the president said in a statement. They will be subject to removal, a policy that will treat Cuban migrants the same way we treat migrants from other countries. The Cuban government agreed to accept those who are sent home, the White House said. The true impact of the decision won't be known until Trump announces a policy toward Cuba. During the election campaign, the Cuban exile group Brigade 2506 veterans of the Bay of Pigs invasion endorsed Trump. At his last pre-election rally in South Florida, Trump told a crowd at Bayfront Park Amphitheater that, "We're going to fight very, very hard for the Cubans," but didn't spell out specific policy. I think there's going to be tremendous pressure now for President-elect Trump to offer a definitive thumbs up or thumbs down on whether or not he is going to reverse the policy when he assumes the oath of office next Friday, Amandi said. Jason Marczak, director of the Latin America Economic Growth Initiative at the Adrian Arsh Latin America Center, said in a statement that Trump is unlikely to reverse today's announcement. Such an action would be at odds with his campaign promises to enforce orderly migration flows. Amandi said the Cuban-American community is split on wet foot, dry foot. More and more it's older exiles who are at the forefront of wanting to eliminate wet foot, dry foot, for a variety of different reasons, he said. Older exiles have fewer direct ties to the island and some view more recent arrivals as motivated more by economics and less by fear of political repression, he said. Jorge Duaney, director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, said Cubans have criticized the wet foot, dry foot policy for many years, calling it the murderous law because it supposedly encourages unsafe and disorderly migration across the Florida Straits. From October 1, 2014 through September 30, 2015, the period after Obama announced a rapprochement with Cuba, more Cubans were stopped at sea while trying to reach the U.S. than at any time since the chaotic rafter crisis of 1994, according to figures from the U.S. Coast Guard. The increase was viewed as a reaction by people on the island wanting to come to the U.S. fearing that it would become more difficult, something that became a reality Thursday. The Cuban government has in the past complained bitterly about the special immigration privileges, saying the policy encourages Cubans to risk dangerous escape trips and drains the country of professionals. But it has also served as a release valve for the single-party state, allowing the most dissatisfied Cubans to seek better lives and become sources of financial support for relatives on the island. People from other nations haven't enjoyed the same kind of status, their return to their countries, as were Cubans who are interdicted at sea. Supporting change is no longer seen as politically toxic in Florida. Obama won't face voters ever again, but U.S. Senator Bill Nelson, DFLA, who is up for re-election, endorsed the policy change announced Thursday. The wet foot, dry foot policy was put in place many years ago to help those who were fleeing Castro's repressive regime. I believe changing this outdated policy in order to be fair to all and also to prevent people from abusing the system is the right thing to do, Nelson said in a statement. The reaction was far different from U.S. Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, a Cuban-American Republican from Miami-Dade County. He issued a blistering statement with the headline, "Have you no shame, President Obama?" With just 8 days left in his administration, President Obama has found one more way to frustrate the democratic aspirations of the Cuban people and provide yet another shameful concession to the Castro regime. Under President Obama's misguided view, after having removed the Castro regime from the state sponsor of terror list and granting diplomatic recognition, the next logical step is denying oppressed Cubans the presumption of political asylum, Diaz-Balart said. This last act of diminishing lifelines to Cubans languishing in totalitarianism is one final despicable betrayal of a people who deserve better from an American president. Obama called his decision, taking important steps forward to normalize relations between the countries. The president also ended the Cuban medical professional parole program, which was started by President George W. Bush in 2006. The measure allowed Cuban doctors, nurses and other medical professionals to seek parole in the U.S. while on assignment abroad. Obama said the policy risks harming the Cuban people. U.S. Representative Ileana Ros Ledinen, a Cuban-American Republican from Miami-Dade, called it a foolhardy concession to a regime that sends its doctors to foreign nations in a modern-day indentured servitude. The repeal of the Cuban medical professional parole program was done because that's what the Cuban dictatorship wanted and the White House caved to what Castro wants, instead of standing up for U.S. democratic values. Willie Morales, a retired Miami-Dade police detective whose parents came from Cuba in 1959 and the early 1960s, questioned the rationale for making such a big policy change in the closing days of Obama's term. When the Trump administration comes in, who knows what will happen? It may change again. This might just be for 2 weeks, he said. He said protests were likely in the Cuban-American community, but predicted the impact would be narrow. This only really affects South Florida. Not even the rest of the country. The rest of the country couldn't care less. People have been coming on rafts in spurts, he said, but many simply come to see relatives and then overstay their visitor visas without penalty. Today, Cuban Americans travel back and forth to Cuba with regularity. Perhaps the most notable case involving the policy was that of Elian Gonzalez. The Cuban boy, then 5, was found off the Florida coast by fishermen on Thanksgiving Day 1999, clinging to an inner tube after his mother and others drowned in a futile effort to reach the United States. He was taken to live with relatives in Miami. But his father, who was separated from his mother and had remained in Cuba, demanded that the boy be sent back. An international custody battle flared until April 22, 2000, when federal agents raided Elian's uncle's Little Havana home and seized the boy from a closet at gunpoint. He returned to Cuba 2 months later. A 2015 Sun Sentinel investigation found America's generous immigration policy toward Cubans has been exploited. The newspaper in Plundering America documented how organized rings of Cuban immigrants came here, recruited accomplices from Cuba and funneled ill-gotten money back to the island in Medicare fraud, auto insurance scams, credit card schemes and other rackets. In a separate series, Easy Money, the Sun Sentinel showed how many Cuban immigrants collect U.S. welfare, then routinely return to the island, sometimes for good, negating the notion that they are refugees fleeing persecution. The Sun Sentinel also found increasing numbers of elderly Cubans immigrating here and immediately getting Social Security benefits even though they never held jobs here. Duaney said there is no question the Cuban exodus has had a tremendous impact on South Florida since 1959, the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. Before 1959 there were smaller numbers of Cuban Americans in Miami, Key West, Tampa, and New York, but the mass migrations of Cubans since the early 1960s have altered the landscape of South Florida. Before, Miami was a primarily English-speaking city with mostly Anglo-Americans and blacks. In more recent decades, it has become a mix of Cubans and other Latin American and Caribbean immigrants. As a result, Latin businesses have thrived, from large multinational corporations such as Bacardi to small grocery stores and restaurants. And Cuban Americans have become so politically involved that for decades, Cuba policy could influence the outcome of statewide elections and even presidential races.